Hello and welcome. This is the Carbon Watchdog podcast. My name is Adam Hardy, and this is the very first Carbon Watchdog podcast. So if there are any technical glitches coming up, I apologize for that ahead of time. If you want to abuse me for them, then you can head over to the Carbon Watchdog website and leave some comments there. And you'll also find the link to my Patreon page if you want to support me in my endeavors, producing more podcasts like this. On my podcast today, my guest is Kate Calvert, and she, like me, is a resident of Islington in North London. And she is a planning lobbyist and a thorn in the side of the London Borough Planning Departments. She is also a trustee of the startup charity Rational Carbon, which seeks to raise awareness of climate change and to help individuals and communities reduce their carbon footprints. And she is also the editor of the Tufnell Park Parent Support Group magazine, which I've read since becoming a parent myself. And I've known Kate for a long time now, and she is the most amazing source of information about all things to do with sustainability and reducing your carbon footprint. And one of the things that I'll be discussing with Kate today is the major low carbon retrofit that she carried out on her old Victorian house, which earned it the accolade of Superhome. So, hi, Kate.
Hi, Adam. Good to chat.
Hi, great. How's it going then?
Well, good. I'd say one of the nice things about being in a superhome after this heat that we've had this summer, and it wasn't part of the plan, but we discovered that when it's really hot in London, this house is really lovely and cool, because all that insulation that keeps you warm in winter also keeps you cool in summer. So it's made the house a lot more comfortable. Apart from any bonus for the outside world and the planet, we're much more comfortable in the house.
Okay, I'm going to pick you up on that, because I read something the other day that said that there's a problem in Europe with all of these really well insulated homes, is that they're going to become incredibly inefficient in with climate change and general warming of the environment. I assume that that's only then in a certain number of cases, and it doesn't apply to you at all, judging by the fact that what you just said.
Well, the house was built in about 1862, and it was pretty shoddily built. We discovered that it was a continuation of the shops on the main road around the corner. So when we look carefully, actually the ground floor is built for a shop, and then they inserted a wall on top of the floor. So I don't think it was very carefully constructed, and they certainly weren't worrying remotely about warmth or air moving in and out of the building. But it has lasted incredibly well. So on the London bomb map, we noticed that a bomb fell just behind this house. And indeed, when the engineer came to look at it, she said, quite a lot of this back wall's been rebuilt. That's not the original brick. So it seems that immediately after the Second World War, possibly during the Second World War, it was just kind of bodged back together again. It was certainly much more sustainable than the current system, where it would be condemned out of hand and the bulldozers would move in.
Right, so there are some positives there.
Yes. And I think that actually it's a bit like, it's not really a plant, but it is a bit like the natural world. These buildings are much more flexible than the new ones, and they kind of shift and adapt as long as you give them enough latitude to do that. So one of the I was really concerned, and I could find no information about, and I kept going to build exhibitions for the 3 years before we had the work done. Is it okay to insulate these houses on the outside? We started out with an architect who was really keen to slap on an external cladding. And I kept going, no, these houses are meant to breathe. That's just the way they work. you know, these bricks absorb water, then the water evaporates.
All right.
Absorb water, water evaporates.
Oh, you don't
Yes.
mean drafts going through.
Not just drafts, actual water.
Okay.
And sometimes drafts. And I didn't know, but I just put my foot down and said, instinctively, this just seems wrong to me. And funnily enough, I was talking to another architect just last month who said, that's a dreadful thing to do to a house. These types of houses are meant to transpire a bit,
Right.
both air and everything else. So luckily, although it was not the cheapest option, what we went for was something called aerogel, which was kind of one of the offshoots of the space race. And we inserted that inside. Now, aerogel is a bit like fiberglass. So stuff can move through it. Should something come through the brick and hit the aerogel, it can move up to the plaster. The plaster is plaster, so things can move through it. So yes, we're insulated, but we can still breathe.
Okay, that sounds like you've
So
got the best of both worlds.
The problem is, luckily, but the problem is that I don't know whether architects don't do this or whether they're only beginning to study it now, so you need a young architect, or if actually they're not that interested and it's a module that they don't have to tick. I don't understand. We interviewed in the end 7 architects.
7?
To find them. 7. And they all said, yes, yes, really interested in eco stuff. Only one had done any eco work, and that was on his own homes. And you think, how hard, you know, how hard is it? It's like,
so it gives you the idea that nobody's actually doing this very much apart from you.
No. Well, it did feel very strongly like nobody was actually doing it. Or maybe some people are doing it, but they're not using an architect. I don't know. But I felt I wanted an architect to talk me through what the options were, because you go to EcoBuild and you have no idea what works, because obviously at the stand, they tell you...
the exhibition.
The exhibition, yes. You go to somewhere where there's a kind of wallpaper with a bit of something shiny on the back, and they maintain that if you paste this on your walls, it will keep all the cold out. I mean, it looks unlikely, and sure enough, the architect said, no, don't touch it with a barge pole. But how are you, as an amateur, supposed to know? I mean, you don't.
That's horrific. It's typical. Yeah, it's just typical of all this kind of stuff. People just don't know, and they've got to dig around and find out for themselves. Yeah. So
I mean,
where does this Superhome term come from? Is that still going? Because I know you did this in what's now 8 years ago.
Yes.
Is it still going, or is
it terminated about 9 months ago, because they were grant funded, and the grant wasn't renewed, and I think they felt that they'd done what they could do. They created this network of super homes. They would have an open day every September at the same time as open house, more or less. And you went up on the website, and then if people wanted to check out a house similar to yours, then they would come and visit and you'd show them around.
So did you have quite a few people coming?
Sometimes, and sometimes, you know, it would only be a couple of people. It really varied from year to year.
Okay.
And they were pretty varied in what they wanted to do, and also pretty varied in what they knew about. I mean, there was one scientist who turned up who was very scary about what is going to happen to the weather once we tip over the 2 degrees point. Very, very scary. I mean, he said, basically, the wind will be so powerful, nothing will be left standing. I mean, we'll all be dead.
Wow. Was he a climatologist, or was he?
And there were other people who were much more interested really in the garden and ended up going home with some cuttings. But you know, the whole range.
So the most expensive bit of the renovations that you did was that insulation with the aerogel, or was it the PV?
No, it was the PV. The PV. That was just over £12,000. Call it £13,000. The insulation came in at, oh no, sorry, the insulation came in at 18,000 in total. But there were many layers of insulation. So we had insulation immediately under the roof, then the floor of the attic, then internal, because we're end of terrace, on two sides, and then some external on some of the back and then at the side, but just around the bottom. So there was, and then we had to do the roof of the kitchen, which extends, and underfloor in the kitchen. We couldn't do underfloor in the main part of the body of the house, because when we took up a floorboard, we discovered that it was so shoddily built, there just wasn't space. The joist was so teeny, there was no room for any insulation to be inserted. So anyway, we put in what we could.
So this is basically typical of London, old Victorian stock London housing, right?
Yes.
And it's probably true of places like Birmingham and Manchester and Edinburgh and Glasgow and all of these places, is it? Or is it a...
I think they vary. Why do I think that? Partly because London was built on clay, or pretty much all the bricks around here were dug out of the ground round here. I'm not sure that is the case. Yes, just off Archway Road, for example, there are postcards which show massive brick fields, but enormous brick fields, where they were making the bricks which then went to build Supper Park. I mean, super sustainable.
Yeah, it is.
You dig the land, you fire the brick, then you on the land you build the house.
I've lived in the area for about 10 years now, in Finsbury Park and in Islington for about 15. But you seem to know about 5 times more than me. How long have you actually lived in North London then?
Since 1981.
Okay, right. Yeah, that's 2 decades longer than I have. Okay.
But
wow.
I think
it's pretty amazing how much you know, actually. Where did you find...
No, it's
you said postcards.
They're postcards, yes. It's partly because I chair a community lobbying group, and as a result, you get links and information that maybe wouldn't normally be circulated. Because if you're trying to preserve buildings, you want to know about the history of the building and why it was built and when it was built, and so you build up a background. That's why.
Yeah, it's I remember seeing a postcard on, I joined a Facebook group called I Was Born in Islington. And there's one chap on there who keeps posting old photographs that he finds. And there's one that he found from Highgate, well, pretty much where Archway Bridge is, looking down towards Holloway. Mm-hmm. And it's all green fields. It's wow. It's just it's pretty amazing. But
well, it is depressing to think of the damage done by the road widening. Which knocked out some early 19th century almshouses, and then got rid of allotments. It was all hooligans, really, vandals.
Yeah, well, that's planning, basically. I don't think British governments like planning, essentially. At every opportunity, any progress made in planning is always taken back. And,
yes.
But well, we're getting away from the insulation. You went through, you listed all of the insulation on your house. It was just like, wow, how many more bits? There's probably nowhere on your house that isn't insulated. And
do you know where we missed? Because we had a thermal image taken at the front. Okay. Because we were offered a cheap thermal image, which was taken at night. What we discovered was that the double glazing on the top floor, this house gets all its weather on the top floor at the front, so we put double glazing there. That was completely black. No heat at all was going out through those windows.
Was this before or after?
After.
Okay.
After we'd done it. Our walls were considerably better than our neighbours, but not nearly as well insulated as this double glazing. But at the side, we hadn't thought that the U value, you know, the insulation value of a chimney breast is higher than an insulated wall. So I thought, that's fine. We'll keep the 2 chimney breasts on the end of terrace wall. That will be sufficient insulation. What the photograph showed is that the opening of the chimney, of course, is not insulated. So there are these kind of almost very long, thin triangles which show that lot is going out through that fireplace. And it's both of them. One of them is enclosed, but there's a vent. That also is, you know, heat is going out there. So we didn't think it through. We should have insulated inside the chimney or something. But meanwhile, interestingly, the architect, despite his expertise, had said, save money, don't double glaze everything. Just hang really thick curtains on the windows where you're not double glazed. So I made sure that on the night when this photograph was going to happen, that I closed the curtains on those windows. We discovered that those curtains, which are double insulated, there's a sort of furry lining and then there's a reflective lining.
Yeah.
They might as well not have been there.
Really?
Yes. So, I mean, they stop the drafts or any sense of cold, but technically shows this, you know, thermal image.
All the infrared is going straight through.
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So there would be one error. We should probably have paid for double glazing throughout. And another less important error is that we put in double glazing on the roof of the kitchen. And actually, because the rest of the kitchen is so heavily insulated, it's cold. Under that glass is cold because the cold air dropped. So we probably should have triple glazed there.
Oh, right.
But, you know, that you can live with.
Right, yeah. Triple glazing.
And also there is a budget, you know.
I can imagine the triple glazing is really expensive, compared to just double glazing. But when you're on a budget, I can see that.
Yes, we didn't look at it.
You can put in double glazing at any point afterwards, though, can't you? Or was it all like comprehensive?
On a sash window, it's kind of more complicated.
Right, okay.
Because, you know, you've got to think about it a bit. So maybe you need a whole new sash that will carry the extra width. And we've paid for redoing all the windows. And I would say Core Sash Windows, who are North London specialists, did a brilliant job. Absolutely brilliant job for half the price of the alternatives. They were very difficult to deal with, but they absolutely knew their stuff.
Oh, really? That's often the case, actually. The less they want to do something, the better they'll actually do.
They really did. I mean, it was like 7 guys turned up and dealt with, we've got a lot of windows here. They dealt with 11 windows in about 4.5 days. One of the boxes needed to be completely rebuilt, and in some cases, some of the sashes. And I mean, they were just completely on it.
Wow. So you essentially had, it sounds like you had 0 insulation before that. So you went from having no insulation to having absolute, almost 100%.
This area was a mayoral low carbon zone, and they issued us with household thermometers, which told you whether it was too hot or too cold. And I think I've got one. Anyway, yes, here we are. And it says, I was sitting here in 15 degrees centigrade, too cold, increased risk of a heart attack, strokes in vulnerable people. Luckily, I wasn't vulnerable, but I was wrapped in a blanket whilst I was typing. You know, that's not really a comfortable environment to work in.
No.
And that was with the heating on, I should add.
Yeah, that's the problem with the sedentary lifestyle or sedentary working style. Mm-hmm. Especially for somebody like me who does most of my work at a computer. It's deadly. Your metabolism just goes, oh, right, okay, my bum's hit the seat. I'm just going to turn myself down and not do anything. It doesn't bother producing heat or anything like that. You have to get up and run around. It's like the I'm always amazed by these outdoor schools like in Sweden and Norway, and you increasingly get them in the woods in England and stuff.
Yeah.
The kids just they aren't even allowed inside. They spend the whole day outside. It's because you're just active. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know how we're gonna go on.
I did consider buying fingerless mittens, but I decided not to. So I've saved on fingerless mittens, extra funding for the house insulation.
So did your heating bill just completely drop massively?
We did put in 2 extra radiators, so it's not quite like for like, but it has dropped. It's slightly complicated because as children have got older, they've learned to turn on radiators in places where I don't think the radiator needs to be turned on.
And let me guess,
like
they
their
don't turn it
bedrooms.
off again either, right?
And then they don't turn it off again. So we're not in like for like territory, but there has been a bit of a drop. It's clearer with the electricity, despite children leaving the lights on, which drives me demented. References to black pool illuminations feature regularly, but we reckon that there'd been about a 50% drop in the electricity bill. Now, part of that is because if we're running the washing machine, we make sure to do it in daylight hours. So effectively, that's free. If you don't run 2 pieces of equipment at the same time, you're not burning more electricity than you're getting off your panels. So you're not being charged for it. So that helps.
Okay.
And then we get our feed-in tariff payment. We squeaked in, there've been sort of phases of the amount of payment being stepped down. We squeaked in just before a step down. So we get roughly 1,700 a year. So we haven't quite yet paid off the 12,000 cost, 13,000 cost, but it was estimated it would take 8 years to do that, and that's probably correct, strictly out of the feed-in tariff. But if you take into account the savings on our electricity bill, then we have already paid it off.
Oh, you have? Oh, that's good.
If you take into account the savings.
Oh, but are you taking into account the cost of all the insulation that you put in?
No.
So that would be probably more or less the same then. You'd probably still be looking towards still paying it off.
No, because the heating is not electrical. The heating is gas. We've got a gas boiler. So there's none of the heating comes off the electricity bill.
Okay, so I would just combine them all into one. If you combine them all into one pot and say, just gas and electricity or whatever,
yes.
I don't know if you've got a dual tariff contract with your energy provider.
We use
or do you have 2
energy. Fine, but they came in the format of the bill, and I've started complaining to them because when I'm comparing year with year, I'm not comparing bills that look like each other. I can't work out whether my predicted use has met my actual use. Can you please just stop? Choose how you're going to lay out the bills, and then I'll be able to make an assessment. But it is in effect a dual tariff because we get both from the same source. So yes, and they have started billing me one single sum, but actually I find it quite useful to know how much is on gas and how much on electric, because the gas does tell me how much is going on heating as an entity separately.
Yeah, I use Good Energy as well, and I was quite impressed by all their advertising. Basically, they go on about they installed the first what's it called, the first three-phase meter for somebody who had a whole bunch of photovoltaic solar panels on his roof. He had a big fat charger for his Tesla. He had a heat pump in the back garden, and had all sorts of other things that he wanted to do. And so he found that nobody could provide him with something that would actually allow him to, like you're complaining, get a good overview of what he can do with it all.
Yeah.
But Good Energy claimed that that they sorted it all out for him. And so I thought, oh, that must be good. And And they've got a little app as well on my smartphone. I just type it in on my smartphone, the gas meter reading and the electricity meter reading, and send it off. And then almost immediately within the hour, I get back the bill saying that they're going to withdraw so and so much at the next direct debit. But I'm a bit of a sucker for advertising, really. I've been equally impressed by Octopus Energy, because they've got a new tariff that's come out, which is sort of a flexi tariff. I think they call it OctoFlex. And when renewable energy is at peak supply in across the national grid, then they will drop the price that they're paying that they're demanding for electricity. So, and just recently they had this big sort of social media whirl about how they dropped their tariff price, the flexi price, down below zero. So they're actually paying you to use electricity. I figure at the end of the day, it's probably just a stunt to get advertising. But there are also some people going, oh, yeah, I turned my washing machine on and got paid for using it. It was really great.
And what time of day is that?
You know what? I'm going to have to look that up. It doesn't make... let me just look that up quickly, because I've actually got something where it said 1 o'clock, and I always thought it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. But now that you're talking about photovoltaics at home, it doesn't make much sense to be penalizing your customers who are pumping energy into the grid from their photovoltaics by actually forcing them to pay for it if you're going to give them a negative price on the electricity. So that just really doesn't make sense. But it might have been 1 in the morning. It might have been 1 in the morning.
That might make sense.
Yeah, well, now that doesn't make sense at all, because there's no solar at 1 in the morning. It might have been because of wind. It might have been a storm going on.
Yes.
And a huge amount of wind energy coming onto the grid. And you know what? There's no point in me looking for it while I'm chatting to you, because it'll probably take me ages to find it.
Tell you what else is a little irritating, which is that we've actually got some flat roof that we could put another 4 kilowatts of panels on, especially because the price of panels has dropped.
Right.
But as soon as we add anything above the initial 4 kilowatts, which is allowed for domestic use, we lose our feed-in tariff. At least whenever I ask anybody, that's what I'm being told. So I will keep asking, just in case at some point we can have the extra panels, because actually that would be quite useful, particularly if, as seems likely, at some point in the near-ish future, you might get batteries in which you can store it.
Yeah, like if you've got an electric car, this is what Elon Musk and Nissan and these car companies are going on about. They want you to plug in the batteries from their car so that you can store your energy in it. So that would actually, what you could do is just to sneak your way around it, is to put your photovoltaics up there and store the energy in a battery and just not tell anybody about it.
Yes. But that does require a battery that's workable. And at the moment, I haven't picked up on any that are small enough to go next to the photovoltaics rather than, on a small industrial site.
Yeah.
They seem to be quite big and quite heavy.
Yeah, I've seen them on the sides of buildings. They're not actually that bad. They're more or less the size of, say, on the street you see those cabinets for telephones, but for telecom companies. They're about just over 1 meter high, so they'll be about that big.
Okay.
So
I'll look into it a bit more. That said, I think I'm kind of supportive of using locally generated electricity because you don't lose that much. But the whole idea of using electricity for cars seems to me possibly not well thought through. Obviously, you get better air quality at the point where the car is being used. Not entirely better, because there's lots of particulates off the tires.
Oh yeah.
But
it's only 45% of the air pollution comes from the fuel, apparently. The rest of it comes from the tires and the clutches and all the other moving parts in the car and the road.
I mean, yeah, and meanwhile, your electricity, lots of it running into your car, is being lost en route into your car. So you've, assuming that you burnt some coal for it, as well as using wind power and so on. Yeah, unjoined thinking, really. So although it seems like a virtuous thing to do to get an electric car, I doubt it. Can't see it happening.
I can see that getting an electric car means buying this great big shiny new hunk of metal that will take all sorts of energy to build, and you would want that to all be renewable. You would hate to have had it built with all of the energy piped into the factory from the coal plant next door. That would be just like a complete waste of time. But I think the point of the renewable energy feeding into the grid, getting mixed up with all the coal and the gas generated and the nuclear generated energy, I think that's it should be clear that if you're buying from an energy provider who gets all of their energy from renewables, then that's fine. The problem is the whole situation gets muddied by the fact that you can the government allows companies to certify their renewables and then sell them. And I'm not quite sure how that works. If they, it sounds like this is I think it's the classic double counting problem, where a renewable company produces electricity and sells it to sort of gullible customers like us, saying, "Oh yeah, we're getting our electricity from renewables, from those wind turbines up on the hills." Whereas in actual fact, what's happening is the energy company then sells off a bunch of certificates for the amount of energy that their wind turbines produced to the coal-fired energy generators, who then use it to flog to their customers under their tariff, saying, "Oh yeah, no worries, you can buy all of this coal-generated electricity because we've offset it with these certificates from the government." And it's like, by the time we've caught up and worked out what's going on, it's it's right.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
You're right. But we should know about those things, and it should be obvious at the end of the day when you think about it. The whole point of renewables is that it's going to replace gas and coal and fossil fuels, and if you don't support the energy providers who are producing renewables, then they're never going to grow. And having a car and using a ton of energy, if it comes from renewables, then surely that's okay. It's just, the question is whether you think it's actually sort of ethically slightly dubious just to use huge amounts of energy, regardless of where it comes from. If you're just an energy glutton, then you should go and live in the Sahara and have sort of 4 gigawatts of solar panels in your back garden.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, we've done a Superhome, but more or less every year we drive to Italy. The car is 12 years old, so it's not like we bought one recently.
But driving's fine. Even Greta Thunberg drives places, although I think she probably rents. No, she can't. I don't understand how she managed to rent an electric car, because I actually tried to do that, but I couldn't get one. The only place that I could rent an electric car in London was from Milton Keynes. So basically, Milton Keynes Council were running a promotion to get people into electric cars. So they were subsidising this electric car hire company to rent out electric Golfs at a reduced price. But the thing is, you can only rent it once, and then they've got your name, and they know that if you keep going back there, then they go, no, you can only do it once, sorry.
Okay.
But other than that, you can't get them anywhere, despite the fact that everybody's talking about, oh yeah, we're going to get a fleet of electric cars. It hasn't happened in a couple of years that they've been talking about it.
Well, also, it will need a bit of international support. And in Italy, there really aren't any charging points. So you could charge at home, maybe. But then you go driving about, then where are you supposed to charge? France is a bit better.
But the Italians are notoriously hospitable, right? So you can just go and knock on a door and say, "Here, can I plug my car in?" and have some wine while we wait. And
the trouble is not when you're just parked on the street outside a guest bed and breakfast or something like that, you know, or a hotel. I don't know. They may shift. But certainly they didn't seem very interested. On the other hand, their sort of white hot heat of technology was in the 60s. And I think they're realizing that those are all coming home to roost, you know, that their concrete bridges and viaducts aren't all the fabulousness that they thought, given that they started falling down. And it seems quite possible that quite a lot of their buildings might start doing the same, because they thought that concrete would be a really good solution because it would be a quick way of putting things up. But they didn't realize that water gets into concrete, and therefore the reinforcement is not stainless and is rusting. So I think there's going to be trouble soon.
But isn't that a problem in the whole world, or is that just because they should have used stainless steel in Italy, or what?
Well, I think in England, we weren't building quite so many of those buildings early on. They threw up a lot.
Oh, right.
It was, you know, their post-war boom, really.
So you've really got an eye for this sort of thing. That kind of segues into your work on the sort of community lobby group for Archway in North Islington, where London Borough of Islington did a lot of work on Archway that came in. Was it last year or the year before now?
Year before now. Yes.
But in fact, you must have been active on this for 10 years, longer.
I think I started 16 years ago. There was a proposal to redevelop the centre of Archway by knocking everything down. So everybody went, yay, those horrible blocks will go, except you discovered that if they knocked them down, the calculation went, in order to cover the costs, we have to build twice as tall. So there's already a 16-story block. You would have been looking at a 32-story block. I mean, it made no sense at all. And as happens with these things, they were firmly reassuring the public that these buildings were at the end of their lives and they just had to be knocked down because they were about to fall down and down and down. And it is a bit like turning around a tanker, and it takes quite a lot of effort, but eventually you persuade the system to take a different view. And they realized that actually the idea of putting a massive hypermarket at the bottom of big new towers wasn't really going to do the local economy any good. It would just make the area less livable. It would bring more traffic. It would bring more trucks. It would damage all the little shops on the high street, which were one of the few things that did seem to be surviving at that stage. And it would also, hurt the area. So eventually planning policy was changed and the would-be developers went away. And sure enough, the buildings transpired not to be at the end of their lives. They just got stripped back to their skeletons and reclad.
So you counted that as a sort of a bit of a victory. Going back to sort of climate change and energy and low carbon and so on. Do you see many of those things going through in all of these projects that are coming? Do you see any of those things coming in as factors that the council and local people and developers and so on are actually aware of? Maybe they're aware of, but even acting on. More to the point.
No, what they do is they manipulate them. There's something called a BREEAM rating, and I can't remember what BREEAM stands for. British Rating Energy. Blah, blah. And what they do is when they're making a practical planning application, they say that this is an X say a BREEAM rating 3 or BREEAM rating 2. But what you can do is manipulate that, as, for example, one of the office block conversions did, which got converted into a hotel, by making the windows very small. Now, if you make the windows very small and you're not bothering to make them double glazed, you're just making it so that the official insulation rating is good. The quality of life inside these teeny little windows is very bad, but you've ticked the BREEAM box. So I think there's a lot of that sort of manipulation. There's a lot of promising to do things that don't happen. So archway heights on the Archway Road, the planning application was put in. It was opposed by most people. And they went, yeah, and we'll create a green roof. So when you walk over the Archway Bridge, you'll look down, you'll see greenery. And then it transpired that, oops, they'd made a mistake. There was no room in the shell of the building for the plant. So the plant was going to have to go on the roof, and sorry, we can't do the green roof. Now, they knew perfectly well that there was no room within the building. But on the original application, they say green roof because they know that the councillors who are sitting on the planning committee will think that that looks good. Thank you. There's a lot of that sort of manipulation going on.
There's no sort of,
and
isn't that like isn't that some sort of impunity there? They can just go and say, oh well, he's going to make. There must be some level of comeback where they go, what? Where's the green roof? Well, I'm afraid you're going to have to retrofit your green roof.
You would think, and there is a department of planning which is called enforcement, but like all planning departments, it's had all its money taken away. They can only really afford to pick either cases where they know they won't get pushback and people will actually do it, or things which are so appalling that they're likely to feature in Private Eye.
Okay.
but actually a commercial developer, of that sort of project, they're very unlikely to bother with. And the commercial developer absolutely knows it. And they play on it. I mean, as one architect said to me, generally those developers use planning advisors. Why do they use planning advisors? Right, they're the developer, they know what they're doing. And this architect said they use a planning advisor to lie so that they don't have to. I mean, I don't know why, but I've never yet met a developer who doesn't lie. It's very strange. Sometimes they lie about things that it's not even particularly in their interest to lie, but they still do it. It's something about the industry.
Oh, you make them sound like estate agents or recruitment consultants or something. God, that's...
I think arguably they're worse.
So do you find that constantly involving yourself in cases like this where you're up against that sort of challenge, don't you find it really disheartening that it's just you're having to battle this constant stream of bullshit? And I suppose there's a bit of a parallel to it in terms of talking about climate change when the internet is so full of all these sort of well-funded climate denial campaigns going on and so on. But no, it's not good. I would.
No, it's not. And I think they do rely on many councillors being very gullible. Pretty pictures, and the councillors go, yes, that would be an improvement on the rundown building. And the councillors can't see that rundown building actually has some really nice brick. And you just need to scrub it and replace the sash windows and you're fine. They don't, why they put people on planning committees who don't understand or care about buildings, I don't understand. But there is the issue that there is no requirement to take into account the carbon footprint of demolition. It's an enormous carbon footprint. It should be calculated, and there should be a requirement that it is made up for, because the default should be you reuse the existing housing stock or office stock or whatever it is. Because it's like, as you say, buying a new electric car. Yeah, it's all shiny and new, but the carbon footprint of that brand new thing is enormous.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, the apparently it takes about 60 years to pay off the carbon footprint of a new building.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. It is
And that,
huge.
yes,
It's
that's
huge.
not being taken into account.
No, not at all. The what you see when you go to places like Thailand or in the developing countries and so on, you see people like with their bricks, with these old bricks, they're recycling them. They're just literally sitting there hammering away at all these old bricks and cleaning them up. And you see them on the sides of the road. I guess you see it in all things to do with recycling, because labor is just because people live on what, $5 a day over there. Then that means labor is so cheap, makes it worth doing it. But over here, you just chuck it. The cost is how much it costs to send it to landfill, and that's about it.
There is that element. The other problem is, however, that if you've used concrete on your bricks, then they're basically trashed. If it's still the original mortar, you can knock it off and start again.
Right.
So you know, you have to hope that nobody pointed the building with concrete.
Right. That should that should be made. That should be brought in as a law. There are tons of laws that could be made that would just be so sensible and would have minimum impact on anybody.
Yes.
So when did you, going back to climate change again, when did you first become aware of this? Because it sounds like that you, well, you know, sounds like basically you were sort of born with it. It seems to permeate a lot, most of the stuff that you've been talking about all the way.
Yes, I suppose, yeah, it's kind of instinctive.
For me,
and I do remember joining Friends of the Earth when I was at university. I haven't done a great deal actively, but I did travel the world, and I observed things like, you know, in the north of Thailand, where they were deforesting and cutting roads into the side of the hill. And you're thinking, that is so unsustainable. You know, the whole thing in the next heavy rains are going to go down the hill. And observing the levels of pollution in the places I was going, which has got worse and worse and worse. And gradually maybe some places turn around. You know, when I was, because I've got family in Italy, we go to Italy. As a child in the northern lakes, we would swim. And then there was a phase in the 70s and 80s where you wouldn't really swim in those lakes, because all of the developments around had stopped going to do their laundry in the lake. I do remember Italy, if you like, had such poverty that people still use the lake for their laundry. They'd acquired washing machines, but the washing machines were going straight into the lake, you know, with all of those very super powerful bio detergents. And of course, it was all getting polluted. And then somebody woke up and said, you know, these lakes, the water only actually fully changes every 80 years. We've got to stop doing this. It's not like it'll just flush out. So now it's back to a level where it's clean enough and you can swim in it. And local people have sort of understood that they need to look after their environment. Cities, I think people have less awareness. They're kind of detached. But the other thing that really distresses me, and I'm not a naturalist, is the damage we've done to the natural world. You know, the number of birds has plummeted, even from when I was a child. And I think it's sort of, without wanting to make a pun, it's kind of the canary in the coal mine. If this place isn't healthy enough for birds, then it's not good for us either. And that distresses me. That said, I live in the first world, and I do drive to Italy, and I do live in a 3-story house, even though there are only 4 of us in it. And yeah, you know, I catch the tube to go to the West End. I don't walk 3 miles. So I can't be holier than thou I do lots of this stuff that is not great. But I do think that either we are going to have to scale back a bit, or we're going to be really unhappy, or maybe not. I mean, one of the interesting things about lockdown actually was that reverting to what felt to me like a 1950s way of living was actually rather nice, in the sense that there was no pressure. You didn't have to rush off to see the latest exhibition or meet friends and look again. You know, you couldn't do it. You could go for a walk. You could quietly go and get some food and come back and cook. And yes, you could talk to friends on Zoom and so on and so forth. But it was a sort of older way of doing things. And I found it interesting that quite a lot of people seemed to like that. Not if they were cooped up with, 3 under 2s, twins and a baby or something. But yeah.
I have I've got a garden. You said you've got a garden, and I think that's one of the key things is that the people who really suffered were the ones who just basically didn't even have a balcony. And so if they wanted to get out, they would have to go and walk down the street and back again, and walk around the block. And so I kind of feel really that I didn't really.
By the people in cities.
I can't even empathize with that, because I can't imagine being in that situation. I mean, take away my garden, my landlord's garden, and I would be. Yeah, it would be a case of cabin fever. I'd just be going stir crazy, I guess. And so all of this stuff with Black Lives Matter and the idea of privilege and recognizing your own privilege is definitely the case. That area there of lockdown where I have got my little flat, okay, it's not that big, but we've got a garden we can go out into. And I compare myself to the other people down this street, or even my neighbors upstairs. And it's tough. That's my privilege and my luck, I suppose. So I'm ready to mention Rational Carbon, which is the charity that we've been talking about a lot, and that I have persuaded you to be a trustee for. And that's all about carbon rationing and carbon rationing groups, and setting up local carbon rationing groups to allow people to essentially combine forces on reducing their carbon footprints. I think at this point in the game where carbon rationing or where rational carbon is very new, I've still got to work out the best way of, or rather we've still got to work out the best way of pitching it to people who don't know anything about it. And I know that when you say rationing, people's antennae go up and they go, or their ears prick up and they go, rationing? You're going to take something away from me. But mostly...
Maybe you need to take a leaf out of the people who do birth control in Africa, who don't talk about limiting children, they talk about spacing children.
Oh, right. That's a very...
Because limiting is a bad idea, but spacing is a good idea.
Yeah, the other thing occurred to me as well is that the only thing that would be rationed is the actual fossil fuel itself. So when you go to fill up a tank of petrol, fill up your car with a tank of petrol when you're carbon rationing, well, and in our case, we're talking about voluntary carbon rationing. So you would be, you join up and you go, right, so I've got my 25 kilos this week. I'm now going to go down to the petrol station and I'm going to fill up 5 kilos. So that is a ration. You could literally only do that 5 times if you've got your 5 kilos of rations.
How about calling it an allocation?
Yeah, I don't know. But when you call it an allocation, people don't.
They don't know what it means?
Yeah, the problem is people don't know what it means. When you say rationing, although people are repulsed by the idea, people immediately know what you're talking about. But what we need to say is, okay, yes, carbon rationing, so you will only be able to get so and so many tankfuls of petrol out of it. But when you're talking about everything else in society, that is going to go through this transition from being fossil fuel based at the moment, whatever it is, whether it's your holiday or your meal in a restaurant or your theatre tickets or your shopping or whatever. All of it has got some more or less degree of fossil fuel energy supply in the system. And what you're doing is you're not actually rationing the products themselves and the services themselves that you're going out to buy. What you're doing is you're rationing the means of production. So you're saying we're going to ration the people who are going out there and producing these really carbon intense products. But if you want to produce the same service or the same product and put that out on the market, but using green energy, sustainable, no CO2 or anything, then that won't be rationed at all. So essentially, it's not rationing, but it is rationing. So it's a kind of it's a bit of a quandary about how to pitch it.
I think rationing is going, as you say, is going to, people understand it, but they don't like it. So it needs to be, it needs a different word. Share, yeah. Maybe.
Well,
even sharing. Children don't like sharing.
Historically, I mean, in a sort of modern history of carbon rationing, it was obviously it was done during the war because you had petrol rationing as well as direct rationing of everything else like wheat and bread and flour and butter and dairy products and meat. And then it moved, and then it sort of was sidelined because we didn't have to have any rationing right up until the Blair government brought in the the Climate Change Act, the first Climate Change Act in 2007 or 2008. And they suddenly started thinking about how on earth they're going to enact that. How are they going to get people to transition from fossil fuels to renewables? And they put forward the idea of a carbon credit card. So you would have your rations on a card. And immediately there was an intense reaction from the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph and the Sun. And it was David Miliband, who was the Labour Home Secretary or the Energy Secretary, who then shelved it, realised that it wasn't the moment politically for it, even though actually if it had been introduced then, everything would have been so much easier. And
do you think it's worth talking?
Sorry, I just wanted to say they used the term carbon rationing. They just said rationing.
Okay.
Carbon rationing.
Well, that may have been why there was such an immediate kickback. But what I was wondering was whether it's worth going to talk to small communities that have suffered from climate change, those places which have been flooded out as a result of the changing weather, whether that would be the place to start. Because small communities talk to each other.
Yeah.
And if you can catch 2 or 3 key people, they will then draw everybody else. And then you've got an exemplar, which you can show another small community that's also been, flooded because of climate change. People need to feel they're not alone in it.
No. What I'm doing right now is trying to get together a founding group of people who are interested in this stuff, who would kind of act as maybe sort of 20 people, 30 people who would act as a sort of pretty much like a citizens' assembly thing that they had for a climate change assembly that they had nationally here in the UK, where people just sat down, they listened to all of the arguments and they made up their own minds. And I'd like to get some people who are obviously going to be interested in doing something about climate change and get feedback about how to do it. How do you implement this stuff? Where do you start? You're going to have to start keeping a tally of what you spend your money on and how much carbon, how much CO2 you actually emit in the course of your daily life. And that's at the beginning, what you just use a spreadsheet and then build it from there. And there's so much to do. It's there's lots of companies out there who are already doing pretty much exactly what this kind of carbon rationing the carbon rationing technology would provide, except for they're doing it for carbon offsets. So what I'm thinking about is talking to them. There's a couple of apps you can get, and they plug into your bank account, and they work out what you've spent your money on, because you can label your transactions on your bank account via this app. So you went to the restaurant, you went to the petrol station, you went to the travel agent, and it does a rough calculation of how much you're using. And at the moment, these apps, the companies who run these apps, then go, you've used 50 kilos of carbon already. Do you want to offset that? We've got this great little market over here, and that's how they make the money. But what you want to do is just feed that into the carbon rationing group, so that they can tell exactly what's going on. And you have it on your mobile phone, and it all runs like clockwork. It would make it really easy. Anyway,
my husband has been reading a book called Surveillance Society, which is deeply depressing. My suspicion, in the light of the content of that book, is that those organizations doing the offset are also selling the information that they're obtaining about how people shop. And, you know, some people will be aware that their information is being exploited and won't want to take part.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. I mean, that's a big concern for a lot of people. To a certain extent, we're there already. We have WhatsApp, and everybody uses it so much, and everybody is constantly surprised that they send a message to their friend about, I don't know what, sort of nail gloss, and then suddenly they start seeing adverts for nail gloss, and it's like, wow, that's a big coincidence.
Yes.
So yes. I mean, I completely agree. That is a danger, and I'm not quite sure how you tackle it, but it would be great to be in a position with Rational Carbon, the charity, to actually have to sit down and have a really good discussion about whether that's how you would tackle something like that. Okay. Because, I mean,
so does Rational Carbon have a spreadsheet that people could access, which tells you how much a Primark t-shirt costs in terms of carbon, or how much driving to Devon costs in terms of carbon? You know, is there something where you can look it up?
Not quite so. A bit more granular than that. Sorry, granular, or do I mean the opposite? A bit less fine. Yes. A bit less fine detail than that.
Right.
And there's a choice. There's a choice. People have been doing these sort of spreadsheets for decades now. You know, all people like Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace and World Wildlife Fund, they came up with these things yonks ago. And unfortunately, because the last thing I wanted to say, just to wrap up, was the last thing I wanted to ask, just to wrap up, was I'm looking for it now again. My brain's gone blank after that techno glitch. Oh yeah, I mean, when I asked you to be a trustee for a carbon rationing charity, I was really chuffed that you said yes, because I really didn't think you would. What do you actually think that? Did you think beforehand, well, carbon rationing is actually gonna be the way to do it, and you were just waiting for somebody to come along and say that, or did you go, oh well, we've got to do something, so why not this, or what?
No, funnily enough, it was my daughter, I think in about year 9, said, there's this book, you should really read it, you'll like it, Mum. And it's the story of a teenager growing up in a family in London at a time when there is carbon rationing. And the family goes to do something, and they discover that the older sister has burnt their carbon ration on buying a ticket to Ibiza to go clubbing, you know, and then the rest of the family are really, really, really pissed off with her. So I had kind of come across it as a concept and thought, well, yes, isn't that how it's got to be?
That was I'm not sure how to pronounce the author's name, but I've got that book and I'm reading it. It's really good.
It's a fun book. It's a fun book.
It's the Carbon Diary. The Carbon Diaries.
The Carbon Diaries.
There were two of them. There were two of them. She did a follow-up. I don't know whether you read that as well.
No, I never read the follow-up. So have you moved on to the second, or are you still only on the first?
No, I'm only on the first.
First, okay. Well, so yes, I had thought of it, and I do think that we have to try our best. I do think I've said this to various people, that Crispin Tickell, who's been working on eco issues since the time of Margaret Thatcher, gave a talk that I went to, and he said he had reached the conclusion after decades that action will only happen after there's a minor catastrophe. And we've had minor catastrophes. I mean, in recent floods, the local sheriff actually died. That's not proving enough. So sadly, I think it's going to take a really major catastrophe before people take it seriously. And yet there are still climate change deniers who have positions of power. And it may mean that, you know, people go, it's going to wipe out the earth. No, it's not going to wipe out the earth, but it might wipe out humanity. Unless we do something about it. And, you know, maybe the population has just got to the stage where it's out of our control. But I still think you have to walk your talk, and you have to try and do the right thing. So that's what I'm doing.
That's great. And that's pretty much the same view that I thought. Well, actually, your second option there, that some people might start thinking that it's too late, describes perfectly the professor of economics that I'm friends with, who his idea is that his prognosis is essentially that the system's never going to do anything about it until it's way too late, and then they will see that the only way to seriously do anything about it will be to bring in carbon rationing, and it will probably cost us democracy and quite a few other things that society holds dear.
Yeah.
Which won't be pretty at all. But I think one of the key factors of climate change and why it doesn't register for a lot of people, especially the people who are just not interested in hearing about why climate change is important, is because climate change doesn't actually cause anything in itself. It just makes things worse. So you're going to have a hurricane. What was the one that wiped out New Orleans? Hurricane Harvey?
Katrina.
Hurricane Katrina. I thought, this is it. This is the big disaster. It's like been made so much worse by climate change, heated up the surface of the Caribbean, and the hurricane just zoomed in there and wiped out everything. Surely now some people are going to wake up. And it's like, oh no, we have hurricanes here all the time.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, I see what's going on now. Yeah.
Yes. So maybe it is, as your economist friend says, that it will come later when it's really too late and it's all done in a rush. But at least this is laying the ground so people understand what it's about.
Yeah. But to pick up on a point that you made a while back in the conversation, actually, I think that there is still every reason to be optimistic about the way things that'll pan out. And the fact that the human population on the planet is 7 billion is just a mind-boggling number. You tell 7 billion to a child, and you might as well say 7 gazillion, because they won't know what that means. And it just basically means that the planet is massively, massively populated, and everywhere you go, you're going to meet people everywhere you go. But there are still scientists whose work tells you that we can support the human race there's enough agricultural and even like with what are viewed as totally incompatible things like organic agriculture. How can we possibly feed the planet with organic agriculture? And yet that is the sustainable way of doing it. And even with that kind of low intensity agriculture across the planet, you can still do it. And so I think there's every reason to be positive about the whole situation, and every reason to push for the best outcome possible.
I had a very interesting conversation with some people who live outside Winchester, which is a fairly right-wing area. And they are good friends with a very, very big farmer there. And they were saying they had recently been to a talk which said there are only 20 more harvests in the British soil unless we change our agricultural approach. Now, these are people who would normally be right-wing and conservative with a small c, if not a big C. And if this is the way we farm, we continue farming like this. They're saying that all of this deep tilling, deep turning over of the soil and losing topsoil is not sustainable. And one of the things that we saw coming through France was exactly that kind of agriculture. You could see the topsoil blowing away with these enormous tractors turning it over. Yeah. No birds following, which tells you, first of all, possibly that there are no birds, but also there's nothing in that soil
no worms
for birds to eat. There are no worms. That is dead soil. So there does need to be a change of approach to agriculture, but it's very interesting. And I am sort of slightly reassured that if people like that are talking about it, then actually it is getting some kind of traction.
Right. Okay.
So there are positives.
Let's leave it on that positive point, though, before we come up with something devastating instead. Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks for interviewing me.
Thank you very much for being my first podcast audience. No, my first podcast visitor. And
right.
So I'll sign off now, and I'll speak to you later. Thanks a lot.
Sounds good. Thanks. Bye.
That was Kate Calvert, and it was my pleasure having her here on the podcast. My name is Adam Hardy, and this is the Carbon Watchdog podcast. All of the website content and the podcasts are free. If you like what Carbon Watchdog is doing, then please head over to patreon.com using the link on the website and support me there. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you'll tune into the next one. Bye.